I'm Leon Todd for G66. Welcome to another Tuesday tone tip. Last week, we looked at getting big tones from small amps using amp models of low wattage amplifiers together with a 4x12 cab impulse. To get some really glorious tones, we're going to use the opposite approach here. We're going to start with a 100 watt amp model, in this case the Cameron CCV2A. This is at totally stock settings, and we're going to pair it up with a really small cab IR, the 1x4 PIG 57. This is the first factory cab in here, and there's been numerous times where I have just dropped an amp and a cab block into the grid on my Axe-Fx III. I'd forgotten that I'm using this 1x4 PIG 57 IR. I've done a bunch of tweaking on the amp and I've been like, this is a really cool tone. I don't normally get this amp model to sound like this. And I go back and I realize it's because I'm using this little cab IR. Before we get going, I have the low cut at 80 and the high cut at 10K, and I'm playing a Les Paul. So let's hear the Cameron at stock settings with this tiny little pig nose IR. That's a pretty nasty rock and roll tone right there. There's several different IRs of this particular tiny little cabinet. I should mention as well, if you were to connect a 100 watt amp to this tiny little 4-inch speaker, you'd fry it really quickly. So one of the advantages of the way the Axe-Fx is set up is like you've got this low risk experimentation factor in there where you can go 100 watt amp, 4-inch speaker. Does it sound good? If it sounds good, we'll use it. And so far, I think it sounds pretty good. Let's have a listen to this 121 microphone on the same cab. I already know the 121, it's a ribbon mic, it's a classic, it's a lot darker than a 57. Let's have a listen to it. But it's got this huge bottom end that other impulse doesn't have. So if you're thinking what I'm thinking, we're gonna blend these two together. The 121 for the low end, the 57 for the high end. Let's just hear them at the same volume. Then I think I'm just gonna balance and blend in that Royer impulse to kind of get what I want. That's really, really impressive. Again, it's a cab impulse of a 4-inch speaker. This is so awesome that we're getting this kind of sound out of it. All I would do in the amp block, I wouldn't even touch the controls, except I would change the speaker impedance curve. Again, we could go for a really authentic impedance curve and go for like a 1x8 or the smallest one possible, but I'm just going to use my favorite one. In this case, I've kind of already done something you can't really do in the real world, which is run this 100 watt amp into a 4-inch speaker. So let's just do something that sounds good. And for me, the 5153 impedance curve is the one I like the most. It's nasty, it's got character, it's like I talked about last week, it may not be the most refined sounding cabinet IR, but what it lacks in that kind of refinement, it makes up for in character. Hearing that impedance curve as being a little tighter in the bottom end, I'd be tempted to just kind of bring the blend on this 121 up a little bit. And here's another really cool trick you can do is in the align feature, you can actually play with the phase of the microphone. So bringing them slightly out of phase is going to smooth out the top end. So I might just take distance 2 and bump it by a little bit at a time. Again, it's very subtle there, but just smoothing out that top end. There's several other IRs of this particular little cab you can play around with. For example, there is one shot with an M160. Let's hear that blended with the 57. That one's really cool, and also a 170. So maybe the 170 with the 121 would sound killer. That's cool, different thing going on there. I think I do prefer the 57 and the 121, and again with that kind of very subtle phase offset there of 0.8 millimeters. There's a few other small cabs in here. If we have a look, I think it's factory cab number 5. This is a 1x6 cab, and we got a couple of different mics on there. The L Tiny is another 1x6. This one has a room mic, which is kind of cool to play around with. But let's try this 906 from the 1x6 cab, and let's try a 121 from it as well. Same kind of blend. A different vibe to the pig nose. I think I like the pig nose a little bit better, but this has its merit, and I think all these kind of unconventional cab choices are worth playing around with. Now that 906 is super, super bright, so we could use the high cut in the preamp tab, or I could actually just use the individual high cut here. Maybe just bring that one down to about 6.5K or something. That one is really, really nasty. I think the 1x4 pig nose, like I said, I prefer a little bit more, but play around with some of those. There are some room mic selections in there, so you can really, really dive deep into some unconventional cab choices here. And like I said earlier, like just because The modeling is so realistic. Doesn't mean that you have to be realistic with everything else. You can actually make this unrealistic, like 100-watt amp into a 6-inch speaker or a 4-inch speaker. It's a whole lot of fun and ties together with what we talked about last week, where we're looking for character and we're playing around with our guitar volume and tone controls and pickup selections and all that glorious stuff we like about all the pieces of gear in our signal chain. It's not just about, say, the amp block or the cab block on the Axe-Fx III. It's not just about your guitar pickups. It's about looking at the whole thing as a system and trying to derive as much joy from that system as possible. And this is definitely a joyful experience experimenting with these things for me. I would love to hear from you if you've played around with these unconventional cab choices. What are some of your favorite combos in the cab block on the Axe-Fx III? And what amp model do you like to pair them with? We just looked at one amp model today, but obviously there's so many other amps we can play around with as well. Thanks so much for watching the video. As always, if you've got any further questions or comments, leave them in the comments below. I'll see you all next week for another Tuesday Tone Tip. Cheers.